In the sweltering heat of July 1518, the narrow cobblestone streets of Strasbourg became the stage for one of history's most terrifying and inexplicable tragedies. A lone woman, known to historical records only as Frau Troffea, stepped out of her timber-framed house and began to move. She did not walk to the market, nor did she tend to her daily chores. Instead, she began a frantic, twisting dance in silence. There was no music playing in the alleys of the Holy Roman Empire that day, only the rhythmic, desperate slapping of her bare feet against the unforgiving stone. Her face bore no expression of joy, no trace of the ecstasy typically associated with a lively jig. Her features were contorted in a mask of sheer terror and physical agony. She was trapped in a prison of her own kinetic energy, a captive to a sudden, violent compulsion that would soon consume the entire city. For hours, Frau Troffea continued her grotesque performance under the oppressive summer sun. Onlookers gathered, their initial amusement quickly souring into deep, unsettling dread. By nightfall, she collapsed from sheer exhaustion, her muscles twitching, her breath ragged. Yet the moment her eyes opened the following dawn, the invisible puppeteer yanked her strings once more. She rose on bruised, bleeding soles and resumed the frantic, jerking motions. Her solitary nightmare was chilling enough, but the true horror of the situation was only just beginning to unfold. The madness was contagious. Within a week, 34 others had joined her in the streets. They abandoned their homes, their trades, and their families, swept up in a silent, collective frenzy. Shoemakers, housewives, beggars, and merchants all surrendered to the same invisible rhythm. By August, the throng had swelled to an estimated 400 souls. The city of Strasbourg was transformed into a macabre theater of perpetual motion. The air grew thick with the stench of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of blood seeping from blistered, shattered feet. This was the dancing plague of 1518, a mass affliction that defied logic, medicine, and theology. The physical toll on the human body was catastrophic. The human heart is not designed to sustain extreme cardiovascular exertion for days on end without rest, hydration, or sustenance. Soon, the inevitable began to happen. Dancers clutched their chests and dropped dead on the street, their hearts exploding under the immense strain. Others suffered massive strokes, their brains starved of oxygen as their bodies diverted every ounce of energy to the relentless movement of their limbs. Men and women collapsed into the filth of the gutters, their legs still twitching in post-mortem spasms. The grim reality of the situation became undeniable. They were literally dancing until they died. Panic gripped the city council. The ruling elite of Strasbourg, a sophisticated hub of the Holy Roman Empire, found themselves entirely powerless against this bizarre epidemic. They summoned the most respected physicians of the era, desperate for a rational explanation. After observing the agonizing spectacle, the medical establishment delivered their diagnosis. They ruled out astrological alignments and demonic possession, declaring instead that the affliction was a natural disease caused by hot blood. According to the prevailing humoral theory of the 16th century, the victims' blood had overheated, boiling their brains and forcing their bodies into this manic state. The council's proposed cure was born of a catastrophic misunderstanding of human physiology. If the blood was too hot, the physicians argued, the victims needed to burn off the excess energy. The prescription was not rest, but more dancing. In a display of systemic cruelty masquerading as civic duty, the authorities intervened to facilitate the madness. They cleared the local grain market to create a massive dance floor. When the cobblestones proved too damaging to the victims' feet, they constructed a sprawling wooden stage. They believed they were providing a controlled environment for the fever to break. Instead, they were building an executioner's scaffold. To ensure the dancers maintained the necessary tempo to cure their hot blood, the city council hired dozens of professional musicians. Pipers, drummers, and horn players were paid by the hour to stand at the edge of the stage and play lively tunes. Strong men were employed to prop up those who were on the verge of collapsing, physically forcing them to keep moving. The intervention turned a tragedy into a grotesque carnival. The relentless, driving beat of the drums acted as a psychological accelerant. Seeing the stage, hearing the music, and witnessing the massive crowd only drew more vulnerable citizens into the fray. The death toll accelerated. The city was inadvertently executing its own people to the sound of a merry tune. When the musicians' lips blistered and their fingers bled, they were replaced by fresh players. But the dancers had no such reprieve. The wooden planks of the stage grew slick with sweat and blood. The city's desperate strategy had failed spectacularly. The realization dawned that this was not a simple imbalance of bodily humors. The authorities abruptly reversed course, banning public dancing and dismantling the stage. The musicians were sent away. In the sudden, terrifying silence that followed, the city turned its eyes upward. If medicine could not cure the affliction, then surely it was the work of a higher, more punishing power. The theological explanation centered on Saint Vitus, an early Christian martyr. According to medieval legend, Saint Vitus possessed the power to curse sinners with uncontrollable dancing. The plague was rebranded as Saint Vitus's dance, a divine punishment hurled down upon the wicked. The city council mandated a period of extreme religious penance. Prostitutes were banished, gambling was outlawed, and a heavy atmosphere of spiritual dread settled over Strasbourg. The victims were no longer seen as patients suffering from hot blood, but as cursed souls enduring the wrath of heaven. Yet beneath the layers of humoral theory and divine retribution, modern historians and scientists have searched for the grim truth behind the mania. For centuries, the leading scientific hypothesis pointed to an environmental culprit hidden in the very bread the citizens consumed. The theory centered on ergot poisoning, a toxic condition caused by Claviceps purpurea, a fungus that thrives on damp rye. When ingested, ergot produces alkaloids chemically similar to lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly known as LSD. The symptoms of ergotism, known in the Middle Ages as St. Anthony's fire, are undeniably horrific. The toxins cause violent seizures, terrifying hallucinations, and a severe restriction of blood flow to the extremities. Victims would feel a burning sensation in their limbs, often followed by gangrene as their fingers and toes turned black and fell off. Proponents of the ergot theory argue that a tainted batch of rye flour could have sparked the initial hallucinations, causing Frau Troffea and the early victims to thrash about in a chemically induced psychosis. However, the ergot theory harbors fatal flaws when applied to the specific events of 1518. Ergotism restricts blood flow, it destroys tissue, and causes profound physical weakness. A person suffering from ergot poisoning would be fundamentally incapable of sustaining the intense aerobic activity required to dance for days on end. Their gangrenous limbs would fail them long before their hearts gave out. Furthermore, the coordinated rhythmic nature of the dancing, the way the victims moved together in a shared psychological space, contradicts the isolated, chaotic seizures typical of ergotism. The true catalyst was not a fungus on the rye, but a rot deep within the fabric of their daily existence. The population of the Holy Roman Empire in the early 16th century was buckling under the weight of extreme social stress. The years leading up to 1518 in the Alsace region were a relentless parade of misery. A series of brutal, freezing winters had destroyed consecutive harvests. The resulting famine was so severe that people were reduced to eating roots, tree bark, and leather. Starvation stalked the cobblestone streets, leaving the peasantry physically weakened and psychologically fragile. The hunger was accompanied by a relentless onslaught of disease. Syphilis, a terrifying new scourge recently brought back from the New World, was tearing through the population, causing gruesome disfigurement and madness. Leprosy and the sweating sickness claimed thousands. The people of Strasbourg were living in a constant state of mortal terror, surrounded by death, starvation, and the pervasive belief that they had been abandoned by God. The psychological pressure cooker had reached its absolute limit. Modern psychology identifies the tragedy as a textbook case of mass psychogenic illness. This phenomenon occurs when a community, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance by extreme stress, experiences a collective psychological fracture. The mind, unable to process the overwhelming reality of famine, disease, and impending death, simply breaks. It manifests the internal agony as a contagious physical symptom. Frau Troffea's initial dance was the spark in a powder keg of communal despair. Mass psychogenic illness relies on a shared cultural framework to dictate the nature of the symptom. Because the people of Strasbourg deeply feared the curse of Saint Vitus, their psychological collapse took the form of the very punishment they dreaded. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of the mind. They danced because they believed they were cursed to dance. The trance state they entered allowed them to bypass the conscious pain of their bleeding feet and failing organs. The dance was a scream made flesh, a visceral, involuntary rebellion against a world that had become entirely unlivable. The resolution of the plague was as steeped in psychological symbolism as its inception. In late August, the city council, desperate to break the curse, ordered the surviving dancers to be loaded onto wagons. They were transported to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus in the cavernous hills of Saverne. There, beneath the dark arches of the holy site, the victims were subjected to a highly ritualized ceremony. They were given small crosses to hold, and their bloody feet were placed into specially consecrated red shoes. Priests led them around the altar, chanting prayers of absolution. For the victims, deeply entrenched in the belief that they were suffering a divine curse, this elaborate ritual provided the psychological permission they needed to stop. The red shoes acted as a powerful symbolic cure for their collective delusion. Slowly, the thrashing limbs stilled, the frantic breathing calmed. The trance was finally broken. The survivors collapsed onto the stone floor of the shrine, returning to the crushing reality of their shattered bodies and their grief-stricken city. The exact death toll of the dancing plague remains lost to history, obscured by incomplete records and the passage of 5 centuries. Contemporary chroniclers claimed that at the height of the mania, up to 15 people were dying every single day. The bodies were quickly buried, the blood was washed from the market square, and the city of Strasbourg attempted to rebuild its fractured psyche. The event faded from daily conversation, transitioning from a lived nightmare into a dark historical curiosity. Yet the shadows of 1518 still linger. The grim truth behind the dancing mania is not found in demonic possession or tainted bread, but in the profound vulnerability of the human mind. It stands as a chilling monument to the devastating power of extreme social stress. When a society is pushed to the absolute brink, when the pillars of safety, sustenance, and hope crumble entirely, the human psyche will find a way to express its agony. The dancers of Strasbourg did not die of a mysterious virus or a supernatural curse. They died of despair, moving to the silent, terrifying rhythm of a broken world.